Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary, was once an anti-communist leader in the liberal student movement in the Central European nation. Since taking up his role as PM in 2010, he has strongly embraced nationalism and right-wing identity politics. Not only have Hungarians overwhelmingly gravitated toward Orbán, but many conservative Americans have too.
He was a marquee speaker at this year's CPAC in Dallas, and even right-wing figure Steve Bannon has called him, quote, one of the great moral leaders in this world. Here to discuss how the autocratic leader is gaining prominence among American conservatism circles is author of Secret City and a journalist, James Kirchick. Jamie, welcome to the program.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So you wrote a piece, I believe, about the American right's sudden love affair with Viktor Orbán. Can you tell us more about, this evolution occurring on what some describe as the new right or the NatCon right, and why Viktor Orbán is now a figure that they revere?
Well, Orbán has really been ahead of the curve on a lot of these sort of global issues that have really attracted the nationalist right, you could say, particularly on issues of national identity, borders, anti-immigration politics. You mentioned Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon actually referred to Orbán as Trump before Trump. And Orbán was reelected to be prime minister in 2010. And really since then, and I've been following, because I used to live in Europe and I was following him for quite a long time. He would say things, and then, a year or two later, maybe even 3 or 4 years later, you would start hearing them being spoken of by other right-wing politicians in Europe, and then crossing the Atlantic here into the United States. I think what was disturbing about this visit here was that just a couple of weeks ago, he gave a speech in Romania where he spoke out against race mixing and went on at length about why he didn't want Hungary to be a nation of mixed races. Unless there be any real confusion about what he was referring to, he praised a notorious novel from the 1970s, a French novel called The Camp of the Saints, which is a very dystopian book about the future where Europe gets basically overrun by a horde of brown and black migrants from the global south who basically take over Europe and rape all the women. And he praised this novel. And so to see him then invited to CPAC just 2 weeks later, I think was a little ominous.
It's interesting to consider how all of the European immigrants that populated CPAC would respond to the implication that they are a horde that has invaded the United States of America to such deleterious ends for the local population. But never mind about that. What is the response to this? Because there is this kind of cognitive dissonance in the United States where there is a strident insistence from many sectors of the right that whatever kind of explicitly racist, white supremacist sentiments exist among their ranks. They're niche, they're fringe, they're not mainstream. The idea of being accused of racism has, in and of itself, taken a whole light where you're basically not able to do it, basically, without your own credibility becoming impugned, no matter how explicit the instance of racism is. So when moments like that happen, when Orbán is kind of very openly embracing things that people are only in a mainstream context in the United States dipping their toe into, what is the response?
Well, it's interesting. Orbán didn't mention that at all in his speech. And in fact, in the article I wrote, I said he reminded me a little bit of Yasser Arafat, who used to say, very anti-Semitic things in Arabic to his people. But then he would speak in English and speak of peace with Israel and whatnot. And it was kind of similar with Orbán, right? He gives this speech in Hungarian a couple of weeks ago, where he's denouncing race mixing and praising this novel. But then he comes to CPAC and there's no talk of that. In fact, the only talk of it is he prefaces his speech by saying, they've called me a racist just like they call you a racist. And so he was very in tune with the audience. And I actually spoke to a couple CPAC attendees, including some non-white people who were there. And they were basically kind of fed up with this accusation that the Republican Party is racist, that Trump supporters are racist. They think that this is basically a liberal media tactic, that they'll be called racist no matter what. There was one woman I spoke to who's Hispanic, and she said that this is like the boy who cries wolf, this racism accusation. So it's an interesting dynamic, and I think ultimately what they were allying with Orban on, or what they sympathize with him with, is this issue of immigration. And during the European migrant crisis, he put up a fence very early. He emerged as the most anti-immigration leader in Europe. And another interesting thing that happened, and again, this is me sort of telling you as someone who's been following Orban and seeing how prescient he is, the biggest applause line was one attacking gender ideology. The line was explicitly, mothers are women, fathers are men, leave our children alone, end of story, full stop. That got a standing ovation and the loudest applause. So, he was reading the audience. I think he knows that, this is becoming an issue on the right in the United States. But I'll tell you, he's been talking about this gender ideology stuff for 4 years. They banned gender ideology in universities in Hungary in 2018. So it's strange that someone from the old world, right, Europe, would be ahead of the curve, I guess, on political trends. But that is what's happening, at least in terms of the American new right.
So a lot of the American new right is, I think, excited that Orban in Hungary has the power and the ability to do that. And then I hear from many Democrats or liberal or mainstream media writers writing about how he's governing as he's a total autocrat. He has democracy is dead there because he's so hijacked the process. Is that a valid criticism? Is it as dire as the sort of American progressives are making the Hungarian situation sound?
So I think two things can be true. He is ruling in a somewhat authoritarian way in terms of the judicial independence, media freedom, the sort of merging of the party, his political party, and the state. All that has been trending in a bad direction, and Freedom House ranks the country as partly free. They actually downgraded it from free to partly free. And I think it would probably qualify as the most unfree country in the European Union. It is a member of the European Union, but it's been obviously moving in a bad direction on all those markers over the past couple of years. That said, he is genuinely popular, and he has won re-election with pretty, resounding majorities each time since he's been elected. So I think both of those things can be true. What is a little worrisome is that I think this is partly why the right in the United States likes him. And you can see this dynamic in our own country, particularly with, say, the reaction to this raid on former President Trump's house a couple of days ago, where a lot of people on the right are now saying, look, there's no neutral state anymore. All these institutions have been hijacked. You see this use of the word regime with a capital R that people on the right are now using to describe the American government. And so I think they look to Orban as saying, look, this guy took the reins of government and he's not letting them go. And that's basically what the left has done in America, and that's what we need to do in response. And it's basically becoming like a zero sum perspective, which I think is very dangerous in a democracy to have that perspective.
Yeah, Jamie, how do people wrestle with the inconsistency between there being such an emphasis on anti-authoritarianism and free speech among the right here at home? Free speech has been a really driving motivator for a lot of these cultural movements. And the authoritarian actions taken by Orban. I mean, banning an entire discipline of study in universities doesn't seem like the most intellectual, DARPA webby approach that one can imagine.
Well, I think this is a bipartisan problem. I think there are actually very few people who support free speech on principle. And we see this, you're absolutely right, with the right. In certain states, red states, right, they're banning books that they don't like, while at the same time decrying left-wing cancel culture and wokeness. But that said, look at the left in America. The left used to be the real supporters of free speech. But once, unfortunately, over the past couple, you could say 10, 15, 20 years, they've basically taken over the academy, mainstream media, Hollywood and whatnot. Once people get into power, they don't really want to support other people's free speech. It's free speech for me, but not free speech for thee. So I think this is a big problem on all sides of the political spectrum. And there are very few people who are actually principled on this, unfortunately.
Jamie, is there a difference, though, between laws promulgated to prevent people from studying what they want or read what they want and people who maybe just organically win the culture war? So I might not love, for example, that Donald Trump became president representing a large chunk of Americans' preferences, but that is what it is. I wouldn't deny the reality of that having happened. Obviously there are political views that I hold. I'm a socialist. I don't expect everyone to agree with me. I don't think that capitalist running America is some plot. I'm not prevented from being a socialist and articulating my views. So far, at least at this stage in American history, I'm not prevented from doing that. And I think that there sometimes can be a kind of a false equivalency between liberals having won the culture wars over the last 20 years and now swinging more to the right, and these literal laws that are being promulgated to prevent people from articulating their preferences if they fall out of step with a more conservative majority. Is that a distinction without a difference?
Well, look, yes, the First Amendment, as we know, applies to the government, right? It applies to the government not being allowed to infringe upon someone's speech. And if there are red states, say, that are red state governors, perhaps, who are doing that, that would be a pretty direct and clear violation of the First Amendment. That said, I think there's a broader culture of free speech, which is really important to protect. And it might not be illegal what is happening in, liberal run institutions like universities or, say, the New York Times. But I think it's just as bad for our culture. So it might not be illegal when, say, a speaker is shouted down in a university, or if the universities are like 96% Democrats, if you look at professors, right? That might not be illegal. It might not be a violation of the First Amendment of our Constitution. But I still think it's a very worrisome cultural trend, and it's something that I think we should speak out against.
To what do you attribute that? Do you think that there is a failure to allow conservatives to advance within the college context, or because I'm curious, because there are some interesting parallels here between this and the way that some conservatives talk about diversity initiatives, and they say, well, if there's some professional arena where Black people or Hispanics or Asians aren't represented, maybe it's because they just didn't self-select into it. Maybe it's because they aren't good enough. What are you going to do? Force the FBI, that's what in the brain. Force the NBA to be X% white just because it doesn't reflect the balance of America? And you get those arguments a lot from the right. But in the context of education, there seems to be a different kind of belief, that the lack of representation of certain kind of conservative beliefs in certain institutions, and I think that's not widespread. I think there are many conservative educational institutions, and that most of the elite educational institutions are in fact very conservative where it matters in terms of their legal and economic philosophies that they adopt and promulgate to their students. But regardless, do you think there's an inconsistency there between a belief that we shouldn't basically do affirmative action for racial minorities in one context, but there should be an affirmative action for a political minority in the university context?
Well, I don't think people should be discriminated against, obviously, for their race or any immutable characteristic. But I do think in intellectual environments, it is important to support intellectual diversity. And I would actually think that that's more important than diversity based on race or gender or sexual orientation or those immutable traits. I think it's more important to have people of varying views and belief systems and backgrounds, class backgrounds, certainly.
Yeah, I'd agree. But the question is this: do you think that they don't exist in educational context because they are being thwarted and kept out? Which is the argument that people of color and other historically marginalized groups have been making about these other contexts? Or do you think, as the right has argued in these other contexts, that it's a self-selection bias and that a lot of conservatives aren't trying to become a certain kind of professor or go into a gender studies department or become constitutional law professors or whatever the argument is or whatever the context is?
Well, within the academy and higher education, I think it's been so degraded since the 1960s. And it really has become a club. And if you don't meet the sort of ideological requirements of these university departments, which are left-wing, then you have no hope and you have no future. And so you just don't even see people of not just conservative dispensation, but even centrist or sort of old-fashioned liberal dispensation seeking academic careers in large swaths of the academy because they have no chance. And so they go into other fields or they go to think tanks. That's really why think tanks started. I mean, they were mostly conservative in the 1970s and 80s because you had all these conservatives who couldn't get jobs in academia. And I think that's bad for everyone. I think it's really bad for our country that academia has become so one-sided. And so, I look at Hungary, and Hungary is basically becoming a right-wing version of this, right, where the media, the academy, basically all the institutions are being overtaken by this one political party and this one leader.
But Orban banned gender studies, right? And there hasn't been a left-wing banning of any discipline in the university context. That's the distinction I'm making.
It's not explicit. That's the difference. It's not explicit, but try getting a job.
Right, but a legal prohibition against studying something I would argue, is a pretty big deal, right? As opposed to, people not having an interest in the thing that you're selling. Yeah.
I'm not here to draw a moral equivalence between what's happening in Hungary and what's happening in the United States. By no means. I actually think it's worrisome that there are right-wingers looking at Hungary as a model.
Well, and that's what I wanted to ask you, Jamie. Do you think there's a danger, for setting aside the moral or philosophical danger, which we've discussed quite a bit, is there a tactical or strategic danger? Because I note, for instance, that now the Republicans' chances of taking back the Senate are suddenly starting to look worse with the elevation of Republican figures who are kind of in a Orban sympathetic or a mold, your Blake Masters, your J.D. Vances, those kinds of characters. Is there a warning to conservatives, to Republican activists that by embracing these very far right type people, they're actually going to lose, or they're going to lose elections that they should be winning easily?
You know what? I think I haven't mentioned this. One of the other reasons why they really loved Orban at CPAC, he's a fighter, right? And that's that word. Why did Trump supporters cling to him? Because he's a fighter. He stands up to the deep state, to the foreign policy blob, to the fake news media, and now they're going after him with the FBI, right? And Orban is a very similar instinct. He stands up to the EU bureaucrats in Brussels. He stands up to the globalists. That's that word that connects all these sort of new right people around the world, is the globalists. George Soros, obviously a major bone of contention and a mutual villain of both the CPAC crowd and Viktor Orbán, Soros being a Hungarian, and Orbán making Soros into this devil incarnate figure, again, before the right in America adopted that opinion. So I think now you have, at least among the CPAC right, they look at Orban and they love him because he's a fighter, because he doesn't apologize. The first words out of his mouth, I'm not a racist, you're a bunch of liars, you're the fake news. And I think that's what they like in Kerry Lake. That's what they like in Blake Masters and J.D. Vance. And they're willing to overlook these, they embrace these attributes that people like myself find somewhat disturbing. They see them as positive characteristics.
Well, Jamie Kirchick, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
More Rising right after this.